Washington Historical Society on February 21st, 1997. David Greenwood is going to give a discussion and slide presentation on Heart to Heart, which is the history of Harts Village.
The topic tonight, the table's not in the waistband. It's not? No. Thank you. The topic tonight is Heart to Heart. I didn't coin that. The Rensselaer Historical Society did, and you'll find out why as we get into the presentation. But it really is appropriate for February, and part of February in the tradition of Valentine's Day is to give cards. Well, the surprise tonight is that everyone will be getting a card from the woman in purple in this, thank you, who's a member of the society, Virginia Seppi Yellen. She's part of the Seppi family. And she had a card made up, a nostalgia card, of what life was like growing up in a section of Harts Village that you may all recognize. So we've got those cards, and at the end of the meeting, at the end of the presentation, you'll all have one to take home, and it shows the railroad and a few other houses. So from Virginia to us, thank you very much for that card, and I know she's here with us in spirit. The reason for the word and title Heart to Heart is because we're focusing tonight on one part of the town of Washington, Harts Village. Poor Mary Ellen, yes. You can always tell the teacher in the group. There she is. Harts Village, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is if you were to exit the bookstore and turn left, that's Harts Village Road, continue down to the end, Route 44A, and you will pass a number of very important early buildings. You'll see those as we continue. Turn left and you'll come across a cluster of early buildings that represent the residential area of Harts Village. So this is a map from 1858. The most dominant feature, it looks like a giant pickle or cucumber, is actually the dammed waterworks, because it's water that made Harts Village what it is. A view from the 1920s shows you the mill dam at Philip Hart's mill site, and that's almost directly behind us and to the north, about 500 feet or more. And that's the way it looked. Another aspect of the waterworks is something quite important. It's known as the Arch Bridge, and this is a postcard of the Arch Bridge. You can just see it and the stonework at the bottom. This is still evident under the new 44 overpass that is by Stanford Road, for those of you who know where that is. The top of the postcard, you can see the underside of the bridge, but the earliest one is actually down at water level. That's an 18th, early 19th century bridge, and that was the main access to Harts Village when it was in its heyday. Well, with that, now let's look at how I got involved with Harts Village and some background. Harts Village, from hamlet to historic district to national register. This is somewhat optimistic, but I made the sign about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, as part of a project I was involved with to help document Harts Village. And this is the reason. In 1984, my wife and I bought this house. We drove down the driveway, took one look at it, and this is pretty much the way it looked when we bought it, and decided that was it. We wanted to be here, we loved the house, and we wanted to find out about it. Destiny, if you will. But that house is central to our involvement with the community. Who built the house? Well, we were told, as we moved in, that this man did. Allegedly Philip Hart, the founder of the village, important for lots and lots of reasons. All the textbooks and all the local books talked about his involvement with the community in the 1780s and 1790s. He prospered, he was a merchant, and ultimately the entire community was named after his family. A number of descendants of Philip Hart came to visit in those early days, bringing with them tales of the house and the involvements. And through them and through their family trunks, I was able to find out not only about Philip Hart, but even more about the greater community. The photograph directly above the gent with the two women, one of them you'll recognize as Winnie Donato, who had our house before we bought it. But behind to the left is his family photograph of what he thought was Philip Hart. In point of fact, the black and white behind is Philip Hart, and this is not Philip, but another relative in the family from the same vintage, same age. We tracked down a number of deeds and documents and found that Philip Hart owned over 1,000 acres, much of it in the village of Millbrook in the present day, and the Hitchcock estate, Daheim. So in the 18th century, 1770s through 1800, he amassed an extraordinary amount of property. In the house, we found evidence on just about everywhere we looked, written in glass, on glass, the names of Philip Hart descendants, grandchildren, daughters. Here we have one, Susanna A. Hart, 1829, etched into our kitchen window glass. There were about a dozen of them. That was very popular in the 19th century. And for those of you who have older houses, always be on the lookout for clues. You'll never know when one day you'll be sitting at a window that you've looked out for 20 years and suddenly realize that there's an initial in it, because that was very common 100 years ago. Other elements that deal with the house were published in the 1930s. This is Helen Wilkinson Reynolds' Dutchess County Doorways, and it shows the center hall of the Philip Hart house as it appeared then. And this is the living room of the house as it was maybe 10 years ago after we moved in. What about the house? Well, we fell in love with the look of it, and we plunged into not only owning the house, but attempting to restore the house. Just about everything was wrong with it that you could imagine. And some of you I know have old houses and know what I mean about that. Everything from the roof to the electricity to the water to the heating, you name it, there was something that needed work done. So we have spent the last 15 years slowly but surely tackling just about everything that could be tackled in that house, and we're about halfway through our list. The first one was the roof, because unless we stopped the leaking, the house wouldn't survive. And then there was the front of the house, and the termites and the rots and the foundation that had settled that we needed to repair. And then there were the other people who lived in the house, the other critters. I'm not talking about the young lady, she's there to help exterminate, but look at the beams and you'll see that we had our fair share of infestation, be it feathered, furried, or multi-legged. They were all in the house. Philip Hart had largesse, and anything that could did live in the house. And that's the way it looks pretty much today. We've restored the roof, we've restored the exterior, we've replaced the elements of the window trim and detailing that had been lost to 200 years of continuous use. We've worked on the plantings and the foundations, and we've stabilized the structure. The house is charming, not only because of the actual house, but because of the landscaping. So I thought you'd like to see, this is our therapy. When we can't tackle the roof, we'll run out and do weeding. The original gate of the house and carriage step dates to the 1830s. The brick house behind the structure dates to the 1830s as well. It was a milk house or cooling house that was part of the dependency of a larger estate. The gazebo, I must admit, we added that. We did that before the roof because I knew if we tackled the roof, we wouldn't have any money left for the gazebo. So we started off with the gazebo. I mean, you know, things must have their priorities, right? And we've enjoyed it for all the years we've been in the house. In the process of digging up the lawn and taking off the roof and rummaging through the walls, we found an extraordinary amount of bits and pieces, shards that are clues in their own right to the history of the house. And these are some of the ceramic and glass artifacts. bottle fragments from the walkways. We're looking at late 18th, early 19th century gin bottles. The one on the left is called a gin or a case bottle. The one on the right is a rum. We found great numbers of these where they were used as fill and discarded after they ceased to serve their original surface. I mentioned before that it was divine destiny, if you will, that we stumble into this house. And constantly we've been amazed by the coincidence of events. The little square bottle foot that you see, the broken piece, we dug up in our pathway. And within a week we had a guest, first time he was ever at the house, Toby Collins. And Toby came to the house with a house gift, the bottle. So we had found a fragment, he brought a complete one as a gift, totally unknowing that we had found a broken one. Shortly after that we found a round element. And a friend of my wife came visiting, and guess what? Brought a bottle, matching the fragments. So we've been very fortunate in that kind of coincidence. Other elements about the house that we need to talk about before we look at the greater village and community. The house had some curious detailing. Under the front window, you'll notice those vertical boards. We wondered what they were. There's no real precedent for them in most design books of the period. They're rather unique. And then look above the window and you'll see another sort of strange field panel with clipped corners and a center medallion. We knew they were original to the house, but we weren't sure what the inspiration was. Well, we tracked it down. Not in an architecture book, but in a furniture book. This is Thomas Sheridan's 1797 book on furniture design. Look at the door panels for the furniture. Look back, and you'll see how the door panel served as a model for the medallion above the window. Then below the window, in the same book, notice those strange little turnings. We found in the center display a depiction of a French window. French windows were designed so that you could actually walk through them. They'd lift up into the ceiling, out onto a little balcony. Look at the little balcony in this depiction, and you'll recognize the turnings. And sure enough, that was the architect's or the designer's attempt to show a French window with a little railing done in wood. Rather naive interpretation, but it makes the house that much more charming. Beyond our house, we started looking at the neighborhood and trying to piece together who's who and where they were from and who built them. We started an inventory through the Dutchess County Historical Society and the Landmarks Group in the county, and that has grown into a project that the CAC has been actively involved with now for a number of years, trying to document all of the early houses in the town of Washington. Articles have appeared in the paper, not only about Harts Village, which is the focus of what you see here, but a number of articles from Carmine's histories on a weekly basis to celebrating the centennial, to early photographs that we've been collecting and that have been donated to the archives. More and more and more, the history of our community is showing up so that everyone can enjoy it. Now, some of the structures in our greater town are well known and already on the National Register, like the Nine Partners Meeting House. Beautiful, beautiful building. And Philip Harts Association was with that meeting house. Here's a photograph, by the way, that I bought at the Smith auction about 3 weeks ago now, showing the meeting house in the Civil War vintage, 1860s. The meeting house is very, very famous, and it was built by the area Quakers as an expression of their religious belief. Many Quakers settled in the community. This is the interior of the building for those of you who haven't seen it. And the earliest settlements around us were predominantly Quaker settlements. Philip Hart was not a Quaker, but his wife, Suzanne Aiken, was, and that's one of the reasons that they were in the community. The Thorne family, another local family with well over 200 years of connections, also traced its ancestry back to this small community that surrounded the Quaker meeting house. As far as our house is concerned, the most immediate association, though, was not Philip Hart, the builder in 1800, but this man, Barclay Haviland, who dominated the house from the 1850s through about 1900. Barclay Haviland, a farmer in the area, was well known as one of the original incorporators of the fair that was in Washington Hollow, very active in the agricultural society in the town of Washington, a major citizen. His children Oh, and this is from an account book from the village, by the way, that we've uncovered. Barclay Haviland, 1863. This is the Curtis and Allen account book, and it records and documents all of the local families in not only Harts Village, but the community. And Martina is a descendant of that Allen who had that the Curtis connection, and she's very excited about that book, and we're tracking down more information. Barclay had 2 daughters. Here we have a Civil War vintage photograph. The one in white sitting on the step in the distance is Carrie Haviland, and some of you remembered her as an elderly lady who died in 1949, Miss Haviland, or Miss Carrie. Her sister Catherine, a little bit older, is standing in the front yard. What's wonderful about this photograph is it shows you how infrequently the lawn was not mowed, but taken care of by sheep, because that was the standard. You'd have the sheep come in and pasture the lawn. So here it is, nearly knee-high to Catherine. The house is somewhat lost behind that forage of trees and things, but it's an important document. I need to point out before I move on something else too. The strange photograph, the earliest one we have of the house. Notice on the porch, there's a curlicue on a chair. You see behind Catherine, you can just make out the silhouette of a strange chair. That chair has come back to us, and I'll explain how in a few minutes. Barclay Haviland's 2 daughters, Carrie on the left and Catherine Haviland, grew up in Harts Village and were very active. Carrie never married. Catherine did. The local doctor, John Otis, Dr. John Otis, who came to Harts Village in 1863, 1864, ultimately marrying the young Miss Haviland, and they moved to Poughkeepsie, right in our own backyard. It's been a long day. Poughkeepsie, where he continued his practice and became a dominant physician in the Homeopathic Society, which has just recently become popular again with preventative medicine. He was very, very important in that. They had 1 child, a son, John Haviland Otis. You see him here as a cadet at the Eastman School in Poughkeepsie. Notice his dates too. He died at 36, quite unexpected, leaving his wife, Louise, the woman you see with him, with 3 young children. She was at 6s and 9s with that. She simply was overwhelmed at the loss of her husband, and gave her children to her in-laws and left the community. The boy that they had, young Otis, Hunt Otis, came out to live with his maiden aunt, Carrie Haviland, because the family thought that a boy should live in the country. The 2 sisters stayed in Poughkeepsie and later married. But our story really now focuses on this man, Hunt Otis. Some of you know him by reputation. He married Amy DeGarris. Dr. DeGarris was a dentist in the community, his first wife. They had 2 children. Then a rather messy divorce. He went to Reno, and the divorce was finalized. And Amy went on to Pleasant Valley and ultimately married into the Hustis family, so some of you know her as Amy Hustis. She died shortly before we moved into the community. Hunt married Lucille Martingale, and we'll see that in a minute. There she is. A music teacher at Bennett College, and also the organist at Lyle Federated Church. Some of you can remember her. They had 2 children, a daughter and a son. And this is the announcement we uncovered for the son's birth. Miss Carrie Haviland, Miss C.E. Haviland, was visiting her cousins, the White sisters, in Brooklyn at the time. So Hunt sent off this to Miss Haviland. John Hunting Jr. arrived at 117, weighed 7½ pounds, peg and baby very well. Hunt. And there he is in 1949. He was the last of the family to live in the house. He went off to the Korean War, and on his return, the family had lost most of its money, and the house was up for sale. and the rest is history. So Hunt moved into Poughkeepsie in an apartment and died shortly thereafter, and the son left the community. So I'm giving you some of the background of the descendants of those people who owned the house. From Philip Hart in 1800 right down to 1953, when the house was sold at auction, it was continuous family ownership. From 1953 to 1969, Miss Sidner Walker had the house. She retired from Vassar. In 1969, the Donato family owned it until 1984 when we purchased it. So that's the history of the Philip Hart house. The whole community, though, has a Hart connection. Many of you know Vera Beret's house, charming, right down at the end of Harts Village Road. It was one of the mills that Philip Hart built, and you can see it here in its earlier form. It was a fulling mill. That meant you took cloth and added texture to it, very much like felt. It was converted to a house. We're standing now, by the way, at the end of Harts Village Road, looking into where Mrs. Beret has her croquet court, for those of you who ever go by the house and look down into the ravine. But it was actually one of Philip Hart's mill ponds originally. Here you see it before it was even thought of as a lawn, but the dam had been taken down. One of the reasons the dam was removed from this site, by the way, is the water was incredibly treacherous. I've come across a number of reports of children and young people drowning swimming in that pond. So the decision was made to remove the dam and return it back to lawn. The Hazard connection, Mr. Hazard, a cabinet maker, converted the house into its present configuration and added a lot of the improvements throughout the village with many of our buildings. So here it is with the new Harts Village Road being put in, the new highway being put in. This is just about 1947. From one side of the ravine to the other, we have a footbridge. The footbridge is still there, although it's fallen on very hard times, and I'm not sure how much longer it's going to last. It connected Philip Hart's house on the western edge of the ravine to the mill complex on the right of the ravine. And here you're looking across to the Owens house, and it was originally the house for the millwright. Philip Hart never actually took care of his own mills. He hired out, and we've come across records of early millers coming mostly from Scotland, living in the area and tending to all of Philip Hart's mills. He had several of them at the time of his death. This is looking back at the footbridge from that little millwright house, right next to, as some of you know, Helen Foster's house, currently owned by Ham and Helen Meserve, where some of the reporters for the Roundtable live. This was actually the little alley between those two buildings. And this was the millwright's house as it looked originally before Hazard updated it with the other details matching the Philip Hart house. Charming little structure. You'll be seeing a number, and that's the way it looks today. All that wonderful detailing based on the Philip Hart house was done by Hazard in the 1940s. And the mill. This extraordinary mill, which is 8 stories. It's the tallest structure in Millbrook, you know. It's 8 stories tall, 4 above street level, and then 4 that march down the ravine to the old mill dam. Its configuration, as you see it now, is based on Charles Dietrich, who updated the mill in the 1890s from an Anson mill. The mill pond site from 1904, this is the dam directly next to that mill, as it appeared at the turn of the century. It has virtually constant water flow throughout the entire year. We live close enough to it so that there's always a lull. You know what white noise is? It's a constant drum or a drone, and it manages to disappear, and it blocks out road sounds. So where we are, we don't get any of 44A, we don't get any of the traffic. What we get is the constant drone of the water going over the dam. It's absolutely idyllic. The little guy, I have to talk about him. Remember the chair that I pointed out on the front porch? A few years ago, we ran into a man by the name of Jim Dibble, who had worked in New York City for the Conservation Department and historic preservation groups and had retired to his family home in New Preston, Connecticut. Well, he just happened to have been the grandson of John Walsh, and of John Walsh. And John Walsh's son, George Walsh, ran the mill as a vulcanizing plant in the 20s and 30s. And young Jim Dibble came every summer to spend time with his grandparents and his aunt and uncle and lived at the mill. And here he is as a young toddler, if you will, with one of the tires that his uncle would have put on the farm tractors. Notice also the bill that Jim gave us. It's to Walter Beck, Innisfree. And he provided most of the tires for Mr. Beck at Innisfree and a lot of the farm equipment. Jim came to the auction in 1953 as a grown-up when all of the Hunt Otis furniture was being dispersed, and he bought that chair as a memento of his youth and gave it to us just 2 years ago because he felt it should be back in the Philip Hart house. Keep in mind, that's the only photograph that we have, the 1860s photograph, and of all the furniture in that entire house, one piece was on the porch. Which piece? The piece that happened to be the chair that this young boy bought in 1953 that gave back to us. Another coincidence. A lot of local families use the Walshes for their car work, and Jim gave me a number of negatives that I've developed of local families and their cars, and we're tracking them down. This is where his grandparents lived. This is the John Walsh house. Recognize it? That's the way it used to look. And then I'll tell you something else. This is where Philip Hart's son, Philip Hart, lived in the 1840s. And Philip Hart built this in 1810. And this is the way the house looked early in this century. Now, I know you've all gone by it. You may not recognize it in this World War I vintage. There's a star in the window, by the way, for a relative who served in World War I. But there it is today. It was expanded by the Walshes and then more recently by the Safaris, who have converted it into rentals. But underneath that structure is that house. And we have found, as I've been investigating through early photographs, this house, a strange little structure, look at the chimney off to the side, 2 windows built to the bank. This was the most common structure in Harts Village. There were dozens of these. And as soon as they could, they were expanded. So there it's expanded most recently. There it's expanded. And here it is again. The only one that remains virtually unaltered, original 1810 Philip Hart structure in Harts Village for the workmen is there. And that's it. That's one of the most historic remaining houses in Harts Village. And there's great pressure to eventually eliminate it to straighten out the curve in that road. And I'm going to fight that.
What year was that built?
They were all in place by 1810. They could easily be even earlier, 1780s, 1790s. They're modest structures. Look at it, the chimney, the 2 windows, forget the wing left and right. That's the structure. Now look back to that early photograph that I got from the Dibbles. Oops, sorry. See the structure? Here it is in another configuration. So this is typical of the workman cottage that would have dotted this entire stretch of bank with all of the farm buildings, and there it is today. Here's another one that in 1890 was converted and advertised, 1893, was advertised in the Round Table. This place for sale, 1/2 mile from Millbrook Station, description next week. It was updated and modernized. Oh, ta-da! You recognize it? It started off like one of those little ones. There it is today. Still there, as it was updated in the 1890s. Extraordinary number of buildings. And there's another view of it. These are ones we go by all the time without even realizing it. That little blue house is on Mrs. Beret's property. I'm showing it because there's one photograph that we're desperate to get. And I see Tom Fiore here tonight. And that is the ice house complex that stood on that site right up through the 1950s. No one has a photograph of it. This was a big structure, one of the largest ones. It cut ice from Dietrich's Pond and from the little mill pond at the Verberais and provided ice for the village and for the neighboring estates. Everyone knew it. Everyone went by it. No one has a photograph of it. I'm hoping at some point. Start up there. On the back of the card, this is called a memory painting, and it's the way Virginia remembered Harts Village down by the railroad trestle in the milk factory when she was a child. The back of the card is a descriptor of her memories growing up in that complex. She gave the original drawing that she had commissioned to the village of Millbrook in honor of its centennial celebration. So the original now is in Village Hall. She had a number of cards made up, and she wanted very much to be able to share it tonight. She's here with us in spirit, if not in physically, and I know she'd be very pleased to know that we have her. So think of it as a Valentine from Harts Village.
David, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. Next, in March, I'm going to hopefully meet with the fourth grade teachers.
Oh yes, we have a captive audience tonight. Yes, they're all here, back row.
And that hopefully will be our presentation. And maybe some of the fourth grade students. Are you in the fourth grade? You're in the fourth grade, you're working on your project right now. Can you give us a little hint on what you're doing?
We have to ask people from the past questions, like about the past, like how did people earn a living in this community? Questions about that.
Did you learn about how they earn their living by watching David's presentation?
Yeah, a little bit.
How do you think they earned their living?
Working in the mill.
Good. Working in the mills is one way. Good. Carmen, do you have anything you want to add?
Fine.
Do you have anything you want to add?
What?
If I could get anybody who's not a member and would like to join or give to our scholarship program, see Harold right after the meeting. Otherwise, if not, Gene Armstrong made some fantastic cookies, right?
Yeah, I made some cookies.
Very nice.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I wonder if I might take advantage of this fine group of people. My name is Pauline Giles. I live in the town of Washington, the western part of the town. On Route 82, north of Hibernia Road. And you may or may not have read something in the Millbrook Roundtable this past week, the February 20th edition, talking about Duchess Quarry being able to mine the property that happens to be directly across the road from us. I'm not a member of the Historical Society, but in our home probably has some historical significance because it dates back to 1821. But the reason I'm appealing to people to read and to inform themselves about that decision is because if the town of Washington does not appeal that decision that was made, Duchess Quarry will be allowed to mine in the town of Washington on that site. That would be, and it's wrong because it's Duchess Quarry is basing their argument on the fact that they have been mining this site since 1987, and that's not true because we have lived there since 1985. And apart from some illegal activity that's taken place where they had a lease to an option to mine, but they have it's a long story, but if people are interested, they should contact the supervisor of Conway or the CAC, or there's a coalition to save rural Washington that's involved, and there's a litigation. They have 30 days to appeal.
Mary Ellen is head of the CAC.
And we have responded to the town board asking for an appeal. Very good. But it just came to our attention just last week in time to go to the town board meeting, and at that time there was something called an order of entry that had not been entered that stops this 30-day clock running. And it seems that now that's been done as of February 14th. I don't know if that's known or not.
Well, according to the account in the round table, one comment made by Mr. Gifford, who is the attorney, said that what they should bear in mind is the influence and the good for all of the people, which I think if you don't want it, you need all of the people to say this.
A lot more than the handful that exist in application. So, I urge everybody to.
There is also an element that we have specific site mining in the town of Washington, and that area is not designated as a mining site.
I know they're in violation of the town zoning ordinance, and that's what started this litigation.
Great. So if anybody's interested, talk to Augie or Mary Ellen.
It's the town board, the town board
The
of
town
people
board.
that you should appeal to.
Has to be notified.
Right.
Thank you very
Mary,
much.
you wouldn't know anything about that?
No,
Just talk to Augie or anything?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. Are there any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
The two properties in Millbrook I wondered about. Excuse me. I just wondered when one can find out about. We're going to have a session with people bringing questions about properties, old properties, and you see and they can't find.
Would we consider that in November, right?
Yes, but also being in touch with Mary Ellen Fiore and the CAC.
Of course, yes.
We're in the process of documenting most of the historic parcels in the entire town. And we've done a fair number of them, over 300. The number keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And we can easily set up appointments. So should anyone like to meet with us and our consultant, we can dig out the maps, dig out the files, and show you what we've amassed at this point. We've got one of the best documentations for a town in New York State, and we've received grants for that. And ultimately, we hope to have all of that information computerized, so you don't even have to come to the town hall. You just zip it on your home computer, and you can find out whatever you want to know.
In the future.
In the future. Right now, we do it the old-fashioned way with index cards.
But Stephanie Morey, who is our consultant, is usually in the town hall on Mondays. But if you contacted me or Stephanie, we would make an appointment, and it's very likely that she's already done research on the property that you're interested in.
It's entirely possible that I may have some information on the town of Washington.
So talk to Mary Ellen or Carmine then after the meeting.
Thank you.
They're the ones to talk to. Are there any other questions or comments? Can I see the fourth grade teachers? Everybody else, come have a cookie, sign up the barrel.